Welcome to episode 91 of the Headspace and Timing podcast. As many of you know, a declining number of Americans have direct contact with those who serve in the military, and the older generations of combat veterans are passing away at an increasingly rapid rate. My guest today is Emily Carley of the Witness to War Foundation, an organization that's capturing the stories of combat veterans in order to preserve those stories for the future.
In World War II, Korea, Vietnam, there were letters being written. These guys were keeping documentation of what they were doing, combat logs, diaries that they were keeping while they were in the service, and there's a lot of written documentation. And what we're seeing with the current generation is there's not a lot of that. They're not writing letters home, they're making phone calls, they're Skyping and things like that. And so we think that capturing these interviews on tape is critically important to capturing these stories because there's not going to be as much written documentation.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Dwayne France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. Once again, and as always, we absolutely appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn about veteran mental health. The main effort of this show and the Headspace and Timing blog is to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. That doesn't mean just changing how we think about mental health treatment, but also changing how we think and talk about veterans specifically. You've heard me say on the show before that every veteran wants their story told, but they don't know how to tell it. My guest today, Emily Carley, is the director of the Witness to War Foundation, an organization that does exactly that, helps veterans tell their stories so those that haven't served are able to know what it was like. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you. It's a little early in Colorado. It's not quite as early in Atlanta, but still early on a Tuesday morning. So I appreciate you taking the time. Before we get into the Witness to War Foundation, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and sort of how you came to this work.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So I have been working with the Witness to War Foundation since around 2006, but I actually started out working for our founder's main business, which is a consulting firm based out of Atlanta. He started a consulting firm around the same time that he started Witness to War, and I came on board to help out with marketing in that capacity. And I found out about Witness to War, and I started assisting him with setting up interviews. And then a few years after that, I started doing interviews myself, and then eventually moved into running the Witness to War Foundation full time. And I actually am the granddaughter of a two-war vet. My grandfather served in World War II and Korea. And when I started working for the consulting firm, which is Insight Sourcing Group, my grandfather actually came in and did an interview with our founder, Tom Beatty, around his service. And so I got more and more interested in these veteran stories. It was very personal to me, with my grandfather being able to share what he had done. And so I got very interested in hearing the stories of other veterans and helping to do those interviews, and just found it was kind of my calling. And so here we are, 13 years later, conducting interviews and all over the country and posting those interviews to our website.
I think that it's great to be able to capture these stories. We hear that the World War two generation is passing. I actually attended an event last year in which it was the first time. It was a gathering of the United Veterans Committee, an organization here in Colorado, and it was the first time that anyone can remember that we didn't have any World War II members, service members in the audience. And then even, the Korean War veterans and now Vietnam veterans. There's not a Vietnam veteran younger than 65. So we know that the older generations of veterans are passing away, and capturing their stories are important.
Exactly. So we started out with our main focus being around the World War II veterans. As you noted, due to their age and the rapid rate at which we are losing these stories, we thought that needed to be our main focus. So the majority of our original interviews were World War II veterans, and then we were also doing Korean War veterans at the same time. And we have moved more and more into the Vietnam generation, and that's probably where the bulk of our interviews come from these days. We do a lot of Vietnam reunions, and like I mentioned, we're traveling all over the country capturing these interviews. We're trying to get to the World War II veterans that are still with us, but unfortunately we're finding that there are not a lot of them that are available to share their stories anymore.
Right. And seeing that, I think that when you and I first connected and I went on to, witnesstowar.org, one of the first videos on there is George Forrest, and me being, definitely not a historian by any means, but, a student at least. George Forrest was, the captain in The Ghost, in the second half of Hal Moore's book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. George Forrest, it played a big role. I think had his own chapter there. And so as I went in and I started looking at a lot of the videos, you have a lot of stories, that I guess people aren't familiar with, that the general public aren't familiar with, but those of us who might have served in the military and studied some of this, that you've captured some pretty interesting stories from some pretty interesting veterans.
Exactly. So we do a lot of interviews with vets that you may have heard of, like you mentioned, George Forrest. And then we're also looking for the vets that haven't had an opportunity to tell their stories, that, maybe people don't even know what they did in the war. The older gentleman that lives in a small town who doesn't have the outlet to share his story. So we're looking for all types of people, but as you noted, a lot of the general public doesn't know any of these stories. So that's what we're trying to do, is get this information out there, make sure that the general public understands what we're asking of people when we send them to war. I think for a lot of people now, war is so far away from them in their minds. They may not even know anybody that served. So the purpose of what we're doing is to try to get that information into the hands of people who don't have firsthand experience with war and combat service. And we can hopefully give people a better sense of what people go through when we send them off to combat, and better understanding of just the amount of sacrifice that these people are going through in order for us to have all of the freedoms that we do and have all of the things that we enjoy, and try to bring it a little bit closer to home to people who don't have that firsthand experience. And we were lucky enough a few years ago to be contacted by the Vietnam War Commemoration Project that the Department of Defense is running. And that's actually how we got connected to George Forrest. And we have been traveling around the country with the Department of Defense program, conducting a lot of interviews with these Vietnam veterans. That's a huge goal right now for them around the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. And we've been assisting with collecting a lot of that content, which has been really interesting.
Right. And that's really, it's really great, obviously, to have been doing this for so long and then to be contacted and even recognized by the DoD as an organization that has done this well. And so public facing, right? We're capturing these stories to try to, like you said, help individuals who have never served understand what it's like. But I can imagine, as I'd mentioned earlier on, that the veterans want their stories to be told. As a mental health counselor, I recognize that a lot of veterans, I call it the paradox of the veteran story. We want people to know what our story is, but we don't either don't want to tell them or we don't know how to tell them. So I can imagine that this is beneficial for the veterans as well.
Absolutely. What we hope is that this is a cathartic experience for the veterans to be able to share these stories that they may have never told anyone, these stories that they've been holding inside for, sometimes over 50 years. And you're right, a lot of people don't know how to go about sharing this story, or they're too humble to reach out and ask somebody to do an interview with them, even a family member. So we find that a lot of people, once we contact them, they're fully willing to do this and they're excited and they're on board, but they've never been asked. Nobody's ever asked them to share their story, and they haven't felt the comfort level to ask to be interviewed, as I mentioned. So I think a lot of people find this a good experience to be able to share with their families, to get it out in the open, to get things out there that they haven't discussed, that they've been holding inside. And we hope that, this is a positive experience for them, and especially the Vietnam veterans who didn't have a lot of opportunity to talk about what they did overseas. And when they came back and they couldn't share these experiences and they had to hold a lot of things inside, we're hoping that we can be that outlet for them to finally be able to share these experiences, get the thanks that they deserve, and be fully recognized for their service. And so that's our hope for the veteran, and that they can leave a lasting legacy for their families. I know for me personally, as I mentioned, my grandfather was a two-war vet. He was in a tank outfit in World War II, saw very heavy combat, and then was in Korea after he got married and he was expecting a baby. He was sent overseas to the Korean War. And I remember as a child understanding that he had been through heavy combat and knowing that there were stories, but we were not supposed to talk about it. I was always under the understanding that this was a very difficult thing for him to recall. And so it wasn't until he was later in his life and I was working with this organization that we sat down and did an interview with him. And I can't even begin to describe how grateful I am to have that information, because it was not something that we talked about freely when I was growing up. And he was finally able to get this information out there and document it. And I think it's just so important for the vets and their families to have when they pass on, as well as the general public.
No, that's amazing. I had a similar experience. My stepfather's father, none of us, I didn't know that he was in the military until after, I think I was serving in the 82nd Airborne Division in the late 90s, and I'd gone back and we were visiting, and he and I were sitting, and it was actually just he and I in the living room sitting there. The rest of the family was, out through the rest of the house. And then he starts talking about how he was, in France switching road signs or switching signs to the towns, and he was laughing. He was making a joke about, all the fun, because he was asking me, I'd been, in Germany before and where I was and things like that. And then I sort of paused and I said, wait a minute, you were in France after D-Day? And he was like, yeah, and I don't really talk about it and things like that. He had been my grandfather, at that point, 15, 16 years. And a lot of those, a lot of the World War II veterans, and again, as you said, the Korean War veterans, they don't tell their family about it. And when they do, it's just sort of the funny stories and the pass by. And it's really critical to be able to capture those stories.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so you bring up a good point too. We interview combat veterans. That is our focus around the combat vet experience, but we're not always looking for the gory combat stories. We want to understand the training that they went through, the thoughts and the feelings that they were having, knowing they were going overseas, and obviously what happened when they were there. But it's not just the movements of the units, but the sights, the sounds, the smells, the feelings, and the humorous stories. One of the things that we talk about a lot here at Witness to War is, we're sending 18, 19, 20-year-old kids away from home, for the first time. Especially in World War II, we're talking about a lot of young men who had never left their hometowns, and we're sending them to Europe and the Pacific. And there are humorous experiences that are dotted in there as well. And we want to capture that. We want to understand the human aspect of war as well. What were they thinking? What were some of the things that they did in their downtime? And those experiences are important to capture as well, so that we have the full scope of the combat veteran and what they were thinking and what they were doing. And then we also talk about what happened when they returned home. And that's very different, as you know, from one generation to the next. The World War II generation came home and they got back to work, and, you know, they didn't really talk about their service a whole lot, but they were considered heroes by the nation. And so that was a much different experience, obviously, than the Vietnam veterans when they returned home. And so we try to get into all of that. What was the difference for these veterans? What was it like when you came home? What did you go through? And trying to capture that full, you know, experience of what they were doing from start to finish, and not just the combat.
Right. And you also bring up a very good point, is when we send young men and young women off to war, you know, my 18-year-old self, just like any other 18-year-old self, is we're kind of knuckleheads, and we kind of do dumb stuff when we're 18. And our brains aren't fully developed. My father was a Vietnam veteran, and he and I were having a conversation. Again, a very similar a discussion. He didn't really talk about his service until even after I had deployed in 2006. But he said the difference between me and him in our combat experiences, that he went to war with an 18-year-old brain, and I went to war with a 32-year-old brain, because I'd been in the Army for 10, 11 years before 9/11 had happened. And so just the difference between going to war as a young person and going to war as say an older leader, do those differences come out in the interviews?
Yes, they do. I mean, we get interviews from people who went overseas when they were just out of high school. And obviously that experience is different from the veteran who had a family by the time they were going overseas. And we see that a lot too with people who were multi-war vets, obviously, the difference between when they first went into the service and then when they maybe went back as an older leader. Obviously those experiences are different, and just the insights that they have. And we have a lot of people that talk about the leadership that they had when they were in the service, and the people that led them, and the lessons that they learned from those people, and watching those people, lessons they learned from people who had already been overseas, and how important that was. And one of the other things that we just started was our educational focus. So our mission since our inception in 2001 has always been three-part, which was preserve, honor, and educate. So we've done a lot around the preservation and the honor piece, but we had not explored a lot around the educational focus. And so we recently launched the section of the site around education. And so this was specifically created so that educators could use the content in the classroom setting. It's a little more age appropriate. It covers a wide variety of interviews that we've done around specific battles and experiences. But I think it's so important to capture the wide range of things that veterans go through or went through in war, because these lessons are so relevant for the students and the younger generation, and they can learn a lot from that. And I think, you know, those humorous experiences are important. These types of experiences help the students and the younger generation relate to these veterans. And I think those kinds of things are important to capture, and to help them fully understand that war is not just what you see in the movies. It's not just all the fighting. There's a lot of other things that go into it. And I think that capturing that wide range of memories is incredibly important.
No, I absolutely agree. And especially, I think for even the current conflicts. And you mentioned that, you know, you started out with, World War II and then Korean War veterans. And those were typically the 2-war and even 3-war. I actually knew a 3-war veteran. He was in Korea, then in Vietnam, and then had been recalled to active duty. He served stateside during the Gulf War. And those were very linear, but even the stories of today's conflicts, you know, I could or am considered a 2-war veteran, having served in both the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters. But it's really it's simultaneous. It's not, you know, it's not linear the way it was. Are you seeing a difference between the older generations of veterans as they're recalling their stories to the younger generation of veterans that you're starting to capture?
Yes, we definitely do. We find that in World War II, especially with that group, there is oftentimes not a lot of detail around where they were and the exact objective sometimes. You know, a lot of times they were just fulfilling a goal and moving from one town to the next, not always with all of the information. A lot of them were privates and, you know, they had not been in the service before. And we see now with a lot of our interviews with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, we get a lot more officers. They know what the objective is. They know where they are. They know the wider implications of the actions that they're participating in. Obviously, news is more readily available. They're more connected to what's going on back home. And so the experiences are different. They're a little more detailed in terms of the actual movements of the units and things like that. But you still get the aspects that come with sending younger people off to war. You know, it's a lot of the same kind of things. The emotions and the humorous experiences and things like that, I think, span across generations. And so I think the type of war, obviously, that they're fighting and the amount of information that they can recall, just obviously due to these being more recent stories, is more detailed. But I think just the type of war and the type of information that was I'm probably making this more confusing than it needs to be. But I think that we have a more informed generation now that's serving. And so those stories differ a lot from what we have gotten from World War II vets in the past. And I think it's interesting to see that transition.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, when someone says, you know, I was in Bastogne, well, that's a big area. There's lots of villages and things like that. And, you know, whether they were with, on ground, the 82nd, the 101st, or if they were, in 7th Army or what have you, but just that I was there in that region or, whereas as you're talking and I'm recalling, the actual bases and locations and places where, where action happened for me, that it is much more detailed. I wonder though if you get cross-generational stories. As I said, my father served in Vietnam. I served in Iraq, and my younger brother had served in the deployment after me in the same area that I was at. My brother and I actually overlapped in Afghanistan for one of my tours. And so we hear this thing about the military being a family tradition now, essentially, that there are more military children serving in combat, than those that haven't. Are you seeing that in the videos the interviews that you're doing?
We have interviewed a few people, father and son, and we have seen people, I would say more of our Vietnam veterans had fathers who served in World War II. I don't know necessarily about the younger vets that we're interviewing now around Iraq and Afghanistan, if they had parents that served and things like that. But I do recall several veterans who served in Vietnam who had come from World War II vets and recalled that. And that was a reason for them wanting to serve in Vietnam, because they wanted to, that was their war and that was their generation, and they wanted to give back like their fathers had done in World War II. And so we see that quite often, and we have interviewed some fathers and sons. But unfortunately, with our World War II generation passing, like they have, a lot of times we find out that somebody did have a father, a grandfather, or an uncle or somebody who served, but they're unfortunately no longer with us to be able to be interviewed, which is, something we would love to have.
Sure. And you talked earlier about, capturing the legacy. But neither of my grandfathers who served during World War II are with us anymore. And my father, and one of my uncles who served in Vietnam are no longer with us. I've got two more uncles who served, who are, but we're not just capturing our own legacy, right? You're capturing the legacy of the generations before, right? I mean, these are stories, and these are stories that are sort of captured within the veteran, and they may tell, their family or not, how it goes. But you're really capturing a legacy of service over the last century, I think.
Yes. So I guess what I would say is that, one of the things that is important to us is to have this cross section. So we have never shifted our focus to one particular group. If like I said, we started out doing World War II interviews because we thought those were so crucial to get because of the age of the veterans. But now we're interviewing anybody from any war, any branch of service, any age, because we want to make sure that we capture these stories regardless of when these vets served. We want to make sure we have this good cross-section of vets and these wide-ranging experiences, and anybody that served in combat deserves to have their story preserved. And we don't always know how long somebody will be with us. We recently figured out that we were losing our Vietnam vets more rapidly than we had anticipated that we would. You think you have more time to capture these interviews, and then we realize that time is passing by very quickly. As I mentioned, we started in 2001, and the Vietnam veterans were, still in their 50s at that point, and now they're in their, they're getting into their 70s, and some of them into their 80s. And so we're seeing that we need to capture these stories more quickly than we originally had been, and so we are willing to interview anybody that's willing to share their story with us.
No, I absolutely recognize that too. My father is here in Colorado, at Fort Logan National Cemetery, and I'm struck by, as I go to visit, his marker that he is surrounded by Vietnam veterans. And that, I think, for me, was the time that I realized that this generation is passing away. My father was 69, still relatively young, when he passed away. And so, yes, this generation is, passing away sooner. The Vietnam generation is passing away sooner. And then, as you said, and I look on the, witnesstowar.org website, and like you said, you're not just limiting to, only, Vietnam or post 9/11, but you have, stories from Somalia, in the mid 90s, and Grenada and Panama in the 80s, and things like that. Those veterans, the Cold War veterans, and even the Gulf War, the Desert Storm veterans, for my generation, are feeling like the Korean War veterans, in the Forgotten War, the small conflict in between the two larger ones. So I personally appreciate the fact that you're branching out and capturing all of these stories.
Absolutely. We love to get those stories because there are so many fewer veterans in those categories. And those stories, like you said, aren't being told by a lot of people. So we love to get those stories. Panama, Grenada, as you mentioned, Somalia. If we can capture those stories, we talk about that all the time around here. It's not just the large-scale wars. It's any conflict that American troops would have been involved in. We want to capture all of that. And one thing I will say about the unique opportunity we have now with the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans is because we've got fresher memories. We've got a way to capture this information in a more timely manner. We don't have to deal with decades going by of memories fading. We can get that quickly, and we can get that captured as soon as they get out of the service, which I think is very important, and in making sure that we get the full scope of their memories captured in a timely manner. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot around here recently is the fact that in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, there were letters being written. These guys were keeping documentation of what they were doing, combat logs, diaries that they were keeping while they were in the service, and there's a lot of written documentation. And what we're seeing with the current generation is there's not a lot of that. They're not writing letters home. They're making phone calls. They're Skyping and things like that. And so we think that capturing these interviews on tape is critically important to capturing these stories because there's not going to be as much written documentation. And so we're seeing that that is a great area of opportunity to preserve memories.
No, that is an excellent point. And now that I think about it, I served in Bosnia, which not really war, but there were people with AKs on the corner and stuff like that. I slept on a cot for a year, and there was definitely danger with the unexploded ordnance. But I recall, yes, writing letters to my mother and my sister, my nephews or my cousins, my younger cousins there. But yes, when I went to Iraq in 2006 and then, Afghanistan twice and even North Africa, I didn't, right? We emailed, like you said, we Skyped or we called when we could or didn't. If anything, maybe we blogged, right? But we didn't, but that was very few and far between. And so that historical record that used to exist. And even going back, that's how we know about, combat in the past and letters from the Civil War and the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. That's something that I hadn't considered, is that future lack of correspondence, is going to impact how future generations view these current conflicts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting study to look at from a military perspective. Records are, a lot better than they used to be around what's going on and where the units are. And, obviously with the media, we have a lot more information at our fingertips around the military actions, but it's that personal experience that's going away. I know that my family has an entire suitcase full of letters that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother from Korea and when he was in Japan. And we have all of that documentation. We may not know a whole lot about the military aspect of what he was doing, but we have the personal aspect, and we can research, the unit movements and things like that. But it's that personal part that we won't be able to get from anybody else besides the veterans themselves. And I just think it's critically important that we capture as much of that as we can, because we're not going to be able to go back and research that. I can go back and look at my grandfather's unit history from World War II and see where he was, but I can't ask him what was going on that day. I can see that they had a big military action, but I can't find out where he was in that at this point. And so I think those are the types of things that we have to consider a lot when we're doing the interviews, is that we may be getting the only record of somebody's service at a particular time that there ever will be.
And this is where it goes into the psychological aspect, because as you said, you're not just capturing, the facts of who, what, when, where, right? We can go back and look at Desert Storm and we can see, the light infantry divisions were on the left flank in the speed bump in the desert, but we don't know what it was like for that private first class to be out there on the end of the line in Saudi Arabia going over the border. And so being able to capture how people thought and felt, so cognitive and emotionally outside of just the simple facts of it, I'm getting a sense of what you're getting through these videos that you're capturing.
Exactly. It's understanding, as I mentioned before, it's understanding what conflict is like outside of the media and seeing it on the news. And it's so far removed for a lot of people. But it's obviously very personal for the people who are in these actions. And I can't watch a story on the news and fully understand what's going on. But if I watch an interview with somebody, I can feel that. We interviewed a gentleman who was an Indianapolis survivor, and he spent 4 days in the water, shark-infested waters. You've heard the story. And I could feel that when I interviewed him. It was an incredibly emotional experience for me, and obviously for him. And it makes me better understand stories when I hear them in the news, or when I watch a movie or a historical documentary about something. My husband and I have been watching the Medal of Honor series on Netflix, and I can recall interviews that we've done and think about when they talk about a location, I think, oh, I know somebody that was there, and I remember what they were thinking and how that felt, and it makes it a lot more personal for me when I watch these things, and I hope that other people will have that same experience.
And that's something that's, in you not having served and your family's service, being, as perhaps far away as your grandfather's, we talk a lot about the military civilian divide, right? The shrinking number of Americans who serve in the military, and that again, we are a very, almost an insular kind of, community. Definitely a different culture and everything else. But we talk about this divide and this gap. We veterans need to step into the gap, but you also, having never served yourself, are stepping into the gap, and others, like you, are stepping into the gap to be able to try to bridge this divide.
Absolutely. I think, it's very important for people to understand what our military members are doing on a daily basis. They're out there doing this for us, and we need to understand what that is. And when we talk about World War II, everybody knew somebody that served in World War II. It was very personal for a lot of people. The nation was involved in wartime service, from manufacturing to selling war bonds. It was very much a team effort. And we had a civilian armed forces. These were people who left the farms or left their jobs or left school to go and serve. And I think there's a disconnect for a lot of people now. I know people that served, obviously, through my work here, and some people I know personally, but I think a lot of people don't. That's very far removed for a lot of people. And I think, and I hope that our stories can help people better understand this type of service, even if they don't know anybody personally.
And so I'm curious to hear how that has been. How has the project been received by perhaps those who had never served? Have you got any feedback on that?
Yes, I think people find it very interesting, especially once they get into the weeds of the site and start watching the stories. We've gotten great feedback from people. There's a lot of people, too, that are trying to find information about what their grandfathers and fathers may have gone through who have passed away already. So we have had people contact us who didn't know somebody in their family from a personal perspective because this veteran maybe had passed away, and they've used our site to try to help piece that together. Where was he serving? What was he doing? And comparing that to somebody who we interviewed maybe from the same unit or the same location, and helping them better understand. So we get great response that way. Within our consulting firm, we have a lot of people who don't have any connection to the service, but they have gotten very involved with Witness to War and what we're doing, and have become very interested in these stories when they previously maybe hadn't been. And I think the educational component of our website that we recently launched will hopefully be incredibly well received. It actually already has been. We're still getting the word out about it, but everybody that's come across it has loved what we're doing because they don't have a lot of resources to bring into the classroom around firsthand accounts. They've got textbooks and they've got videos that they can watch, but having somebody that actually served in a particular battle or can recall a particular experience has been incredibly well received. Teachers are super excited about being able to use this material and having something that the students can relate to. And I think that people really like having this information at their fingertips. They don't have to go interview anybody themselves. They don't have to download anything. They don't have to go and search for it. It's all right here, and it's free to use. Everything on the site is free to view. It's all categorized. So if you only want to see something by somebody who served in the Army Air Corps in World War II in the Pacific, you can get to that type of experience and find what you're looking for. And I think people really like that.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at that portion of the website now, and you're right. It's definitely amazing. Just the whole project that you're doing is amazing, but how it appears to be set up, I'm of course thinking of, making connections and people that I know, who are trying to preserve the legacy. And that's essentially what you're doing, is preserve the legacy, but also educating the public. There is another aspect that I'm curious about, and one of the things that has been changing is the role of women in combat. I'm certain that in not having looked through a lot of them, not a lot of women from World War II and Korea, maybe some more from Vietnam, but definitely more from the more recent conflicts. Is there a concerted effort, or has there been anything that you have seen for Witness to War, specifically looking at women in combat?
Yes, you bring up a really good point. So when we were really focused on World War II interviews, the majority of the female interviews that we got there were women who were nurses. We have seen, as we've shifted, we obviously had a lot of nurses in Vietnam, and so we've gotten some of those firsthand accounts, and we are now seeing more women who served in combat zones that we're able to interview, and we have done some of those, and we are definitely planning to do more. We've talked to some women veteran organizations around collecting a lot more of those interviews, and me personally, as a female, I'm very excited about seeing some of those stories online. I think a lot of people have this misconception that women don't serve in combat capacities. And even if a woman is not on the front lines all the time, they're serving in combat zones. We have interviewed women who have been severely injured overseas, serving in areas where combat was very prevalent. And so I think that's a really good opportunity for us to educate people on the role of women in service as well.
No, I think that's great. I served in an occupational specialty that was both male and female throughout my entire military career. And the argument against women in combat ended long ago, but it definitely ended when my driver dismounted behind me in Afghanistan to make sure I didn't get shot in the back. So I am not someone who says that women don't have the ability to serve in combat, because I've seen it and I've experienced it in some of my best soldiers, of course, male or female really didn't matter, but it is interesting to see, and I started to see some of that as I was looking through some of the videos about the stories just about women in combat are going to shift. So I really appreciate that you're doing that as well.
Well, thank you. We definitely want to make sure that we're telling the full scope of the combat veteran story, not people from just one area or one demographic or one type of background. We want to make sure that we have a great cross-section of people who represent the American people and the American vet. And so we're still looking for veterans. We look for them all over the country. We travel all over the country. I think we visited something like 18 states last year conducting interviews. So we're still very actively looking for these interviews. We want to find people who don't know about us and haven't had the chance to share their stories, and let them know we're here and we have this outlet to provide them, and they can share these stories and make sure that these memories aren't lost.
No, this is outstanding, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. And hopefully this will be able to spread the word and be able to get more people understanding what Witness to War is and what you do. And so and you mentioned that you travel around, how would a veteran get involved with Witness to War to be able to share their story?
Well, they can contact us through our website. They can email me directly, or they can email our interviewer who does all of the traveling around to capture these. There's no charge to participate. We do like to try to group veterans in a particular area. So if somebody contacts us in an area where maybe we don't have vets already listed, if they could help us pull together groups of veterans, friends of theirs, if they're in an assisted living community and they know other people that might like to participate, that is a huge help. If there's anybody listening who knows vets and maybe is not a veteran themselves, but can help us set up interview days, that's great too. We're pretty flexible about how quickly we can get to people. So people can either email me or call us or whatever works for them. We have a forum on the website, and they can use that as well.
Yes, and I'll definitely make sure that all of those links are in the show notes to be able to contact. Does Witness to War have social media anywhere else besides witnesstowar.org that people can find you?
Yes, we do. The bulk of our content will be on Facebook and Twitter. You can see upcoming locations where we will be, upcoming reunions that we will be at. We do a lot of reunions around the country so that we can capture veterans from similar units. They can contact us that way. We will show occasionally featured interviews that we've done and things like that. So we do a lot of social media. So I would encourage people to follow us on there. That's where you will get the most up-to-date content.
No, that's absolutely great. I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about Witness to War, Emily.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I always love to talk about what we're doing and hopefully reach more vets.
That's the goal.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. I'm glad I was able to connect with Emily in order to have a great conversation. While some of you may be wondering what an organization that films veterans telling their stories has to do with mental health, this goes into the category of things that are beyond just PTSD and TBI. When we talk about veteran mental health and wellness, we need to understand the entire comprehensive aspect of the veteran mindset. The Witness to War Foundation gives veterans an opportunity to tell their story, and the inability to tell that story, or even the unwillingness to do so, is a significant barrier to wellness for many veterans. One of the things that struck me during this conversation, and you heard it at the beginning, was the idea that veterans of the current era are no longer leaving the legacy artifacts that will help future generations understand what we did and how we felt about it. We're so often living in the current moment that we don't tend to think of the impact for future generations. As Emily mentioned in the show, current era veterans aren't writing letters that can be preserved for future generations. What we know about all of the conflicts from the Revolutionary War all the way up to Vietnam was not just from official military documents or media coverage, but from the words of the service members themselves. That likely started to shift with the Persian Gulf War in the early 90s, but it certainly has an impact on the global war on terror. So check out the Witness to War Foundation and the great work that they're doing to preserve the stories and legacy of generations of combat veterans. You won't find your time wasted by the inspirational stories on the website. Go to witnesstowar.org to check out what they're doing. Thanks for taking the time to check us out. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/091. While you're there, share the link to the show with someone that you think may enjoy it. One of the challenges in changing the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health is spreading the word. You can subscribe on a bunch of different podcast players like iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and many others. Check them out at veteranmentalhealth.com/platforms. I'd like to give a shout out to several colleagues who have left a review on iTunes. Stan Lake of Catching Creation, veteran mental health advocate and Vietnam veteran Paul A. Dillon, and combat veteran and clinical mental health counselor Amy Otzel have all taken the time to write a review. It would be great if you could do that too. An honest rating and review will help spread the word about what we're doing. Leaving a review on any platform will help increase the visibility of the show. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us next week for another great episode, and until then, remember veterans, you're not alone, ever.
The struggle is real, found a piece and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. I'm stoned. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini me's, broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith.
Amen.
I bow my head and I pray.
Keep praying.
Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way,
Tell 'em, man.
but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray.
Keep praying.
Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I heard each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall,
Come
I'ma
on.
call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head